Hello everyone, my name is Chinmay. Welcome to my channel, The Grant Specialist. Today we'll be looking at the MRFF Grantee Variation Policy and I'll be explaining the guidelines for those. So what we'll be looking today is some introduction of what it is, some principles around that, some notes to RAOs and chief investigators, the variation process, the types of variation, and some key contacts. So variation process and the types of variations are a bit critical here because we have MRFFs. One set of MRFFs is managed by or administered by NHMRC, which has a different process. However, there's another set of MRFF applications or grants that are managed by the Business Grants Hub, and there's a separate process for that too. So I would strongly recommend to clearly understand the processes for both of them. Right. Some introduction. What is a variation? It's a change to a successful grant. This can be a change to a funding period, different commencement date, delay is happening during the grant, a change to the end date. If you want some extension to your grant, change to the research team, research plan in general, or change to an administrative institution. It can be a very varied number of things. So this policy or this session is dedicated to MRFF funded projects. So it will be applying for all projects funded by MRFF. It won't be applicable for projects funded by the NHMRC. So for the project funded by the NHMRC, yeah, I would strongly recommend you have a look at our previous video in which I have explained guidelines for NHMRC's grantee variation policy. Right, some key resources here, as we discussed previously, MRFF, there are some administered by NHMRC and some administered by the Business Grants Hub. So there's an MRFF grantee variation policy that I have hyperlinked there for both of them. However, in terms of the process and the policy for NHMRC and the Business Grants Hub, they're different. So we have different sort of links there for one for NHMRC and one for Business Grants Hub. Also, for MRFFs administered by the Business Grant Hub, there's a MRFF grant variation request form through which you submit variations. There's an activity budget template through which you submit any changes to the budget, or if you're applying for any variation regarding the financials of the project, that is the template that you use. If you're applying for a variation in regards to the chief investigator change or change in the project team itself, that's the chief investigator template that you use there. Also, if you're applying for a change of expenditure request form, let's say there has been some change of expenditure for your overseas collaborators or overseas chief investigators and so on. So that is the form, which is a change to expenditure request form that you apply for. So for MRFF projects administered by NHMRC, these variation requests are submitted on NHMRC's systems called Sapphire, but for the Business Grants Hub, it primarily happens on an email, and then that gets forwarded to the MRFF delegate, which then makes a decision whether the variation has to be approved or not. So the key difference with these two is one happens entirely on an NHMRC system called Sapphire, while the other happens entirely based on emails. And there's no system by the Business Grants Hub to manage successful projects or submit successful variations to the successful projects. Right, some principles. So, in making decisions for your variation, as I said, the program delegate is the person who it goes to. So, they will be making the decision based on is the what's the outcome of the variation on the project outcome, does it align? Is it consistent with the program policy that you have been applying for? So, if the program policy, or let's see if it's an MRFF funded project, it has a specific program policy. So, does this variation actually align with that policy, objectives of that policy? Does it align with the grant opportunity guidelines? And is it any relevant to policies of health research? So that's all that they look into, right? They also look into are there any changes to the timings of the grant payments that will happen as a result of this variation? Are there any changes to the completion of the grant as a result of this variation? Are there any risks and strategies in the updated risk management plan? You know, are the changes in the risks and are there any strategies being mentioned in the risk management plan that is submitted with the request? And also, the last but not the least is the availability of funds. So, due to if we approve the variation, do we have funds to cover for that project? So that is something that is very critical as well. So these are the things they'll be looking at when they'll be accepting or approving your variations for MRFF projects, right? So some key things to remember there. A project variation request has to be submitted at least a month in advance, right? A grant variation, MRFF's eligibility requirements, to meet those eligibility requirements, you can't just submit grant variation requests. So uh, when you accept an invitation to be a part of the grant under the funding agreement, it's an expectation that you will be the part of the grant for the duration of the project, and you can't change that. Uh, when you submit a variation to MRFF, we strongly recommend contacting the other chief investigators as well and let them know that this is going to happen. So when an RAO submits your variation request to the funder, it is an assumption made there that all the other CIs on your project are aware of the change to the project. So notes to the RAOs and the chief investigators. RAOs are always the first point of contact for any grant administrative matters, and we are RAOs re- are allowed or are they, expected to maintain a record of the reasons of variation and the proposed variation and any supporting documentation for that variation. And administering institutions are required to manage the flow of funds in according to the varied arrangements, right? So if the variation gets approved, then the administering institution who is administering the grant on your behalf has the responsibility to manage the flow of funds. So notes to chief investigators. So do not contact NHMRC directly if you have any questions. Why we say NHMRC there? Because for grants, for successful MRFF projects that are administered by the NHMRC, you will need to contact NHMRC, and then NHMRC will forward your request to the program delegate in the MRFF team. So do not contact NHMRC directly regarding any questions. Please contact your RAO first and discuss the situation with them. If you feel that the variation or the types of variations that are available does not suit your need, or if you want to get some advice about, okay, which variation type should I be applying under, your RAO will be the first point of contact to you. And if you come across a situation where you don't reach out to a decision, please let your RAO know to contact MRFF, which they will contact on your behalf and get answers for you from the MRFF. Uh, so one thing to remember, if you're extending the grant date for any project, any successful project, the CIs, the other CIs on the grant, that will impact their ability to apply for other grants, right? From the eligibility perspective. So please be sure that they are aware that this is going to happen. So they are supportive of you submitting a variation to extend your project. So exceptional circumstances. What is an exceptional circumstance? The circumstance that could not be foreseen or was not foreseen, but it occurred, and we, it was unlikely and is unable to be effectively managed or mitigated within the original project plan. Right. So if that kind of circumstances happen, that is considered as an exceptional circumstances for the variation purposes. So if you're applying for an due to an exceptional circumstance, please make sure that your circumstance fall under that category of exceptional circumstance. So I think in that case, MRFF will be able to approve your variation if they're satisfied with it. Variation processes. So as I said initially, there are different processes for grant administered by NHMRC and then grants administered by the business grants hub. So we'll discuss both the processes. For the grants administered by NHMRC, the process remains similar in regards to the NHMRC successful project, where CIA reviews the variation policy and submits a variation request in Sapphire, which is the NHMRC's grants management system. The RAO will review it in alignment with the policy, with the guidelines, and then submit that to the NHMRC. NHMRC will review the request and make a decision on the variation request, right? They will notify, so in the background, NHMRC will forward it to MRFF and the delegate will review the request and let you know of the decision. And then NHMRC is the one who communicates the decisions to RAO with the email if the request has been approved. NHMRC's grants management system will get updated where required, and also for the MRFF funded projects, just and that is because it's administered by NHMRC, and they will update the milestones, any other updates that need to be made under your project in the NHMRC system. That will be done. If the variation is rejected, then RAO, your respective RAO will be asked to give a written confirmation that the grant will continue as originally awarded and what was previously approved. If it doesn't, then there might be other options that we might need to look at, which will be looking at the types of variations, or you might even have to relinquish a grant, if it's you are not able to complete as it was previously approved, if the variation gets rejected. Right, now let's look at the grants administered by the business grants hub. So there's a request form that we saw in our key resources on the key resources page. So CIA will complete the request form and provide some supporting evidence to the administering organization's RAO. The request form is mandatory, along with, if it's a change in the budget, then the budget template has to be submitted along with the request form. If there's change to the CIT, then the chief investigator forms need to be submitted along with the request form. But the request form has to be submitted to RAO. RAO will review this policy and alignment with the policy and submit it to NHMRC. RAO then certifies the request form and submits it along with any attachments to the program delegate. And there's a specific file name requirement, which is MRFF variation request hyphen grant ID hyphen the variation request type name. So that is very critical to have when an RAO is submitting the form. Then the BGH, which is the Business Grant Hub, undertake a preliminary review of the request and provides the request to the Department for consideration and delegate and decisions by the delegate. Upon the notification to RAO, if the request is approved, again the relevant variation novation instrument as applicable will be issued. So what happens is, in Sapphire, the milestones will get updated on the online portal. But as I said previously, everything happens on an email based on the for business grant hub grants. So they will release a novation agreement. What does novation mean? A change, right? So they will release a new agreement to the administering institution, and they'll be asked to sign it or approve it. Unless and until that approval happens, then the flow of funds will not continue to based on the change that was approved. Again, if the variation is rejected, then RO will be asked to submit a written confirmation that the project can be continued as previously approved. So it's slightly different process, but one thing to note, for NHMRC administered MRFF grants, everything happens on Sapphire. For for business grants hub administered MRFF grants, everything happens on an email. So there has to be a request form submitted in the request form along with some supporting evidence. Your RAO will have a look at that form as well as the evidence, ask you to correct something if it does not align with the policy or your grant guidelines, and then submit that form along with supporting documentation to the Business Grants Hub. And who do they email the form to is, in the guidelines for that particular grant that you're successful in, they will have the details of the program delegate on to whom that form must be sent. So the RAO will be aware whom the form needs to go to. You don't have to worry about that as a CIA. And once the notification comes in, an agreement will be sent, and you will be notified by a RAO as well that this is approved or if it's rejected. Now let's look at some type of variations here. One is, so we'll go one by one. So one is defer in commencement date. So that variation, as in our previous video as well, we discussed that variation has to be submitted if there's a delay in starting the project. So there's some time between the grant success date versus the grant commencement date. So in that time, the CIA and the administrative institution is expected to have agreements with other parties and get the other contracts in place, accept the MRFF funding agreements, and so on and so forth. But if there's a bit of delay in that, yes, that is the grant. That is the variation that you must be applying for. Even if there's delay in recruitment, that can be, and you want to move the start date forward, that is something that you apply for. Defer in progress. So defer in progress is something that you apply for if there's a delay in the grant in progress. So the grant payments have begun, the grant expenditure has begun, but during the process of your research, there has been significant delays, and you want to, let's say, stop the clock till those delays are complete. So that is what you apply for in different progress grants. So in different progress, the end date gets extended by the time the grant suspended or deferred. Right? Extension of end date. This is usually applied towards the end of the grant period. So let's say in the last year or so, you realize, oh, I won't be able to complete the grant in the specific time frame. Then that is the variation that you apply for, which is the extending end date variation. So that actually extend the end date by a maximum of 12 months. Even in the previous two, the maximum duration of extension or deferment is 12 months, right? Relinquishing the grant. So this happens in very specific circumstances. So if a scenario occurs where you might have to relinquish the grant and you are not able to complete the grant in the time frame, yes, that is the variation that you apply for. Transferring of administering institution. So this is when you are moving to a different organization as a CIA and you want to take your grant along with you. So how the process works here is the new administering institution, sorry, the retiring administering institution informs the new one that okay, this grant will be transferred to you, and the new and provides them with with an acquittal of or a record of unspent funds. The new administering institution actually invoices the retiring administering institution for transfer of any unspent funds to the new organization. The retiring administering institution then provides that acquittal to NHMRC or MRFF, and then also provide a letter to the grant CIA that they are happy for the grant to be transferred, and then the grant moves over. If it is an MRFF grant which is administered by NHMRC, they will send you a transfer schedule or transfer award that you need to accept. The new administering institution will have to accept that, and then the grant payments will start to the new organization. Right? If it is for the MRFF administered by the Business Grant Hub, then once the capital is provided to the Business Grant Hub, they will release a novation agreement, and a new agreement will be sent to the new administering institution where the previous party retires and the new party comes in as an administering institution. Once they sign it and send it back, that is once the grant payment will commence. Right? So change to the grant activity. So this is a variation that is very critical. So I mean, this variation is required if there is a change to the aims or change to objectives of the proposed project that was previously approved. If you're talking about an advanced technique that you're using or a technique that will help you achieve the outcomes quicker, more efficient techniques, and so on and so forth, they don't need a variation for that because it's dedicated towards achieving the aims and objectives that were previously approved for this project. However, if it is more about changing the objectives altogether or changing the aims of the project altogether, then yes, you need to change the grant. You need to submit this variation to change the grant activity, and this gets approved on a case by case basis. So it's not always that the variation will be approved, it might get rejected as well. The next one is change to personnel. So this is a variation. For example, in a previous video, we saw change to CIs, CI team, and so on. That's exactly the same variation for change to personnel. So if so for grants administered by NHMRC, we submit this on Sapphire, and the CI team, and this will be approved on a case by case basis because, as I said, when you decided to participate on the grant, it is your responsibility to stay on the grant for the duration of it. So this is very approved on a very case by case basis, and it completely depends on why there is a change to personnel. So, for example, if the CI is leaving the grant because they want to be eligible to apply for other grants, as I said previously, that is not allowed. So it has to be either the chief investigator is incapacitated and they can't actually work on the grant anymore. Yes, that's a valid reason. Also, if the chief investigator dies, then that's a valid reason as well for approval of change to personnel. Also, it might be a scenario where the person gets incapacitated and they have to replace the person with a person of a similar skill, right? So that is when you use that type of a variation. One thing to remember here for the MRFFs administered by BGH, you need to use the chief investigator template to be submitted along with your request form for this type of variation. So change to FTEs and research support packages. So this is used in MRFF grants for MRFF granted fellowships only, right? So this is on a very case by case basis, again, depending on what sort of condition, what sort of the scenario it is. If it is about, reduction in the FTE due to personal circumstances like carer's responsibility and so on, yes, that might be possible sometime. And when you're going back from the carer's responsibility back to a full-time FTE, that is also approved on a very case-by-case basis, because then that comes down to availability of funds with the MRFF for that duration, right? The last is the change to expenditure, including overseas expenditure. So, for example, if your project includes some overseas chief investigators or overseas organization working on the project, and there has been some change to expenditures for the money that's being transferred to them, not as a salary, because as you know, an overseas organization or overseas CI cannot receive salaries from an MRFF grant. However, there might be uh, some work done overseas by the CI in his lab, and you might want to transfer the money to them as a part of that service. Yes, and there's some change of expenditure there. This is the variation that you submit for MRFFs administered by the Business Grants Hub. There is a change of expenditure form that you fill in and submit uh, with your variation request form. All right. If you have any questions, please feel free to put in the comments below, and please do not uh, and please feel free to like, share, and subscribe if you have learned something from it. Also, if you want me to make any specific videos for your particular research, please put down in the comments below, and we will be happy to accommodate that request. Thank you.